So let's dive a little bit deeper into BBM92 itself and how we get from these entangled states to secret keys that we can actually use in some kind of security system. So the first step is to actually generate and distribute these quantum states, right? In this case, we are encoding our entanglement in photons, but more specifically in the polarization of photons. So we start with something called an entangled photon pair source. These are specialized components that generate pairs of photons that are entangled in their polarization. And we then distribute one half of that pair to Alice and the other half of that pair to Bob. And now these photons, as they're distributed and reach the two nodes here, they do maintain this entangled quantum state, and their polarizations are actually correlated. So when you measure one, you have an idea of what the other one will be. Okay, so we've distributed our entanglement. Now what comes next to actually reach a final secret key? So once the photons are distributed to Alice and Bob, we're still in the quantum realm. They're still a quantum state, but what we need to do is actually measure that quantum state in a certain way in order to produce classical bits, zeros and ones, that can be used ultimately for a key. So the way we measure these entangled photons is very important here. And this is where a lot of the security comes into play. So Alice and Bob here, upon receiving their photon, or their half of the pair, they need to do what is called a random basis measurement. There are different ways to measure quantum states and different bases in which we measure them. So the state here we're preparing, and you can see that on the bottom left, is the HV plus VH state. This is also called a Bell state, or an entangled state. Now the H and V, they stand for horizontal and vertical states of polarization. Now there are different ways to measure the polarization of a photon, and the idea is we want to project the photon that we receive onto a certain basis and way we're actually looking at the polarization. So we actually need to randomly select which basis we're going to measure in, whether it's the horizontal vertical basis or the diagonal anti-diagonal basis, which is another way of projecting these states onto something that is measurable. But that randomness is really important in driving the security properties of BBM92 and most any QKD protocol. So Alice and Bob, they don't coordinate which basis they're going to measure in. And that's actually a security feature. So Alice and Bob will do this random selection independently of each other. Now, half of the time, they will measure in the same basis, and half of the time they won't. So there's a process that we need to do called sifting. Sifting is essentially getting rid of the data and the measurements that do not agree on the same basis. So when Alice and Bob do measure in the same basis, these are bits that we care about. These are bits that actually can be used for key material. But if they don't measure in the same basis, we render those measurements kind of obsolete and not useful, so we get rid of them. And that process is called sifting. Now, even when Bob and Alice measure in the same basis, in an ideal scenario, if there's no noise, if it's a perfect state, a perfect system, perfect measurement apparatus, they should, with certainty, know what the other party measured, right? So if Alice measured in the HV basis and she gets an H, a click on her H detector, then she knows that that Bob should have measured also in the HV basis and should have gotten a V click, right? So in that case, that's the first state on the left, the HV state. Or alternatively, Alice measures a V, then she knows that Bob should have measured an H. That's in the ideal scenario. However, these are noisy systems. They're deployed on real fiber with noise. Measurement apparatuses are not perfect. There could be errors in our system. So even when Alice and Bob do agree on the same basis, just by chance, right? Then there still may be errors. So maybe Alice gets an H and Bob also got an H. That would be considered an error. So we have to do some measurements of that level of error. And what that is called is the QBER, the quantum bit error rate. This is a very important metric for how we actually look at these networks in terms of performance and in terms of security. So Alice and Bob need to actually exchange some and sacrifice some of their raw key material in order to estimate this level of error, right? So even when Alice and Bob do agree on basis, how often did they actually correspond to what they expected versus how much error was present? Okay, so that error estimation step is very important for maintaining and guaranteeing the security of the keys that we ultimately generate. And that's a unique property of these quantum systems, right? This is something that we can't really do with classical math-based approaches like public key cryptography. Finally, there's a step called privacy amplification. And this is, as the description says, it's amplifying the privacy of our key material. So there's some additional exchange of the raw key material to actually amplify the secrecy or the privacy of the bits that Alice and Bob ultimately agree on. And all of these steps, it does involve exchange of information, classical information between Alice and Bob, right? Hey, these are the bases I measured in. This is the level of error I'm estimating. There's some information exchange in order to do the privacy amplification. However, any adversary or eavesdropper listening to those communications, it would not give them any information about the key. So that's a nice security property of this protocol. So once we finish all those steps, we do arrive at our final secret key. And these can be processed in chunks of useful sizes. For example, encryption keys can be 256 bits. They could be 512 bit chunks, depending on how you plan on using these keys for encryption. So just to summarize, what are the key security features of BBM92? Well, entanglement is essentially guaranteeing these non-local correlations between Alice and Bob at the quantum level. And we're leveraging that, we're measuring that to generate secure keys. And in the process, through that error estimation step, we can actually do some what's called eavesdropper detection. This is a very nice security property unique to quantum cryptography. So we can actually detect if there was some adversary or eavesdropper trying to mess with the quantum signals. And again, that mere act of measuring or observing the quantum transmissions between Alice and Bob will actually change the quantum states themselves and will produce very irregular kind of measurement patterns that are detectable. So you get this notion of kind of sensing if there's some level of noise that you didn't expect or that's too high. A nice security feature of these entanglement protocols as well is that there is no reliance on a trusted photon source. So that component that generates these photons at very high rates, right? It's just pumping out pairs of entangled photons. That does not necessarily need to be a trusted component. In order to trust the keys at the end, we do not necessarily need to trust that source. Ideally, we want it to actually generate entanglement, but there are ways we can actually verify if entanglement is present. If these correlations that we're getting are actually quantum correlations and they're that strong, or if they're just classical correlations or no correlations at all. So this does not require any trust on the photon source. Now, going back to the key metrics, right? How do we use these metrics to guarantee security? So one key metric here to think about is the QBER, the quantum bit error rate. Now, there's a threshold we can set for the QBER. And essentially what that threshold is telling us is if the QBER is below 11% in this case, we can actually guarantee that the keys are secure, that any adversary listening in on all of the communications, the classical communications between Alice and Bob, would not know any information or very little information about the key. So that they'll be unable to actually decrypt any of the information that Alice and Bob send to each other. If it's above this threshold, i.e. we have too many errors in our system, that we can no longer make that guarantee, hey, these anomalies we're seeing these patterns that maybe suggest there's a lot of error in our network, and that could be due to the network itself, the actual noise in the system, or it could be due to an adversary, an eavesdropper that we can't necessarily see, but that adversary is messing with the system, right? So in that scenario where the Cuber is above the 11% threshold, we cannot guarantee the security of our keys. And so what do we do in that scenario? We don't use the keys for encryption because they're not secure, right? So we only want to actually generate and use these keys when the Cuber is below that threshold. And now the threshold may change depending on your security profile, right? The sensitivity of the data you want to actually transmit, your security posture in general. But this is the conservative threshold to take, whereby if the Cuber is under 11%, we can guarantee that security. But if it's above, then yes, it might be due to some bad components or a bad channel in your system, but it also may be due to an adversary, so we can no longer guarantee that security. And then we have more traditional performance metrics, just like you'd expect in any kind of network, right? How fast is it? How many keys am I getting per second? So we look at things like key rate as well. We also look at key buffers, right? How many keys are we storing at Alice and Bob? How many do we have in case the quantum link or the quantum network goes down or the Cuber is too high? We don't want to bring the rest of the network down with it, right? So we have this notion of a key buffer that is used for redundancy and to keep the network up and running. And if you saw our last webinar on the orchestration of this kind of network and how it's used, that's something we also monitor, right? How many keys do we have stored in our buffers, and how long can the network operate even if the quantum link does go down? Okay, so that was a deep dive into BBM92 and all the protocol steps that we need to run to actually get to a final secret key that we can really stand behind and confidently say, this is secure, this is secret to just Alice and Bob.